countries have gone further along the road in these sectors. So a country like Myanmar, with the right legal structure, can attract a lot of interest in the power, in the ports, and in other areas.
Is the legal structure, whether in Myanmar or other countries, is that a main roadblock for you?
Well, if you're talking about foreign direct investment, definitely the foreign ownership is an issue, and state ownership is another issue. So those are the legal issues.
Do you encounter the same issues, Mr. Lam?
Well, for Myanmar, we're just starting, so we didn't really go into depth yet. But in Vietnam, at the moment, it's quite open. Most of the infrastructure asset the foreigner can participate. It's not an issue for us at the moment.
I think, Stephen, you were talking about statistics a while ago. Did I get the figure right that at least ASEAN needs about $60 billion a year of infrastructure investment, and you said that it's only getting about half of that?
Yeah, government investment and private investment in infrastructure is about half of what it needs to be in order to meet the demand as we forecast, but between now and 2020. But I think there's also, this about just investment needs, which are critically important. But we also covered the need to develop bankable projects and how important that is. But there's also critical innovations that we have to be addressing and focused on. And I would identify those as project structuring. We've talked a bit about that. We need innovations in governance, and how do we get the public sector to work properly in order that it understands what the needs and demands of the private sector are, so they can facilitate that kind of investment. We need innovations in municipal finance. If you look out at the future, what we have a fastly urbanizing region, Asia as a whole. We have 120,000 people moving into cities every single day in Asia. The urban population in ASEAN alone will double between now and 2050. So municipal finance is a huge challenge, and we need to find ways that we can innovate municipal finance. Capital market development is critically important, because if we can't develop the capital markets in the region, if we can't deepen the capital markets region, we have banks that are pulling in long-term finance for infrastructure. Has banks in this region. Banks are with Basel III and Solvency II. Banks are pulling out. So capital market development is critically important. And lastly, regional financial integration is a linchpin here too, because if you can't find ways for the cooperation between these countries, we're just not going to realize the full potential of ASEAN.
I forgot, Johan. I think it was you who said that you are opening in Myanmar soon, right?
That's right.
Right. Could you tell us about that project?
Yeah, we want to grow with Myanmar, so we're starting with small projects. We're opening an office there beginning of next month, and we're very happy with that. And we've been participating through partners in the country. I think we can play a very important role, not just with rolling out new infrastructure, but around the region. I'm seeing so much that we could do with the existing infrastructure. So to help with upkeep, renewals, improvement programs, energy efficiency programs. That's a major topic in the region.
I found that very interesting when you were talking about energy efficiency a while ago. Obviously not as sexy as building a power plant, but you said as important?
It's not so sometimes we go for these very visible infrastructure projects, but the International Energy Agency report says that only 15% of the economically viable projects today in energy efficiency is being exploited. So that's an incredible opportunity. Just one product from our company, a variable speed drives, in 2012 saved the equivalent of 50 nuclear power plants every year. So an enormous opportunity. And I see in ASEAN that we've got to keep this balance. There's a huge need for new infrastructure, the visible projects, but we've got to make sure that we address regulation that encourages energy efficiency. One of the other sad statistic is that the coal-fired power plants we construct today in ASEAN is at least 10% less efficient than the same power plant in Japan, using the same fuel. And we have to have a balanced mix of plants. But if we're going to build a coal-fired plant, let's at least make sure that it's an efficient one.
Since you freely plugged a specific product there, I hope you don't mind if I put you in the spot a bit. Could you tell us what's your growing market in Southeast Asia where you don't have a power plant?
Well, for ABB, the fastest growing country at the moment, I think, is the Philippines. So we are growing very rapidly in the Philippines, supplying products, supplying technology, supplying services, supporting the infrastructure.
When are we going to get a manufacturing plant?
Manufacturing plants, I mean, we want to be as local as possible. So in every country where we see sustainable business and a sustainable market, we are opening factories and we want to be local. And there's many benefits from being local. I mean, there's knowledge transfer. You are able to look after the infrastructure that you've put in place, so it makes it sustainable. And I mean, it's the only way to really understand the local context. So we want to be as local as possible, but you can't be everything everywhere. So it's got to be linked to sustainable markets. And I think the wonderful thing in ASEAN is the diversity, so which helps not to have overlap between the different countries. So each country can play a different part. And there's a lot about coming together and integrating.
How much more money, Mike, is going to flow into Asia or Southeast Asia from agencies like OPEC in the next few years, you think? Is it going to accelerate?
Well, I think it is, just based upon the underinvestment in infrastructure, which has been slowed down in all of parts of the world as a result of the financial crisis. So I think we are going to see obviously strong multilateral presence already that exists in Asia, but I think that's going to continue to increase. What we're also seeing as well is going back to this question of creating the enabling infrastructure, we're seeing an opportunity to catch up a little bit in the private sector participation in comparison with other parts of the world. Latin America has also been underinvesting in infrastructure. Interestingly enough, they've been able to attract, however, a higher degree of private participation in their sectors by having suitable enabling environments in Mexico, Chile, and Brazil, to name some of the lead economies.
These regulatory environments you've been talking about, right? Correct.
So they have been able to attract, even though they have still been underspending relative to the percentage of GDP, which, you know, many say should be about 5% of GDP as a total target for infrastructure investment. And the Asian economies have been averaging about 1 to 2%, as the Latin American economies have, targeting 2 to 3%. But the amount of capital that the Latin American economies have been able to mobilize has been greater. I think that's the opportunity zone that would exist for the ASEAN nations in being able to increase that private sector participation.
Mr. Razon, you earlier said that each project is different. I guess each country is different as well. But do you see some distinction in terms of regions or continents in terms of regulation and dispute resolution, bidding systems, etc.?
Like I said, Mexico is, I think, one of the countries that is ahead in sophistication in the legal structure, transparency, and financeability of projects. They've been very good at what they do, and projects have moved rather smoother there than other regions. But again, it's really what sector is financeable, you know, at the time. And you know, very large projects that have a lot of public service involved may not necessarily be the right return. So they take a long time to get these projects off the ground. Very long to finance, very long to put the project components together. That's why you have projects taking 10, 15 years. But the more profitable ones, where the private sector will go after right away, are the ones that move much faster.
I think I know the answer in your case, but I'll ask both of you, including Mr. Lam. There's no shortage of money that wants to be invested, right?
No, there's a lot of investment. Investors looking at this region want to invest. There's plenty of money. It's just that, like I said, there's nothing is bankable or investable sometimes. So I think we have another panel some time ago, yesterday, was that they should be looking at maybe an ASEAN sort of code for bidding for infrastructure development, so that, because each country is different, we don't have to be 100% standardized across ASEAN, but it could be, if you get up to maybe 80% there, it's already saving a lot of time from a lot of major institutional investors that's coming in from Europe or US want to invest in this region. It saves them effort, make it easier for them to actually participate. So one way is for ASEAN to get together and make sure you have, you know, this standard code.
But before you answer that, let me just tell the audience, I'll have Stephen answer this, but we're ready for questions. If you have any, please just stand up or raise your hand, and somebody will come to you with a mic. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, just on that point briefly. I mean, Asia as a whole, but ASEAN as well, is a saving surplus region. There's large reserves in the region within the governments. These savings, these reserves are invested in low-yielding Treasury securities in the U.S. and in the because capital markets are not developed in this region, because there aren't alternatives to turn those reserves into productive assets. And so this is a critical challenge for the region, because you can take money that you're just sticking into Treasury securities and otherwise find ways of mitigating and developing that and investing it in productive infrastructure in the region. And that's the critical challenge that I think the region really faces. And this is how you've seen infrastructure development happen in the developed countries of the world.
So I guess the frustration is there's money to be invested. You yourself, Mr. Lam, said you want to invest more in Myanmar, but the structures aren't there to support that. Could I ask the Minister, what's the main challenge in terms of getting the rules in place?
So it's very important. So in our reform measures, the administrative reform measures is also very important. So innovation, and also we want to change our systems at the time. The most important thing is we have to fulfill our hopes with we have to be good prospect, and also we have to concrete rules, regulations, and procedures we should have. But sometimes our regulations are very outdated, so we have to review it, and also sometimes we have to amend, and sometimes we have to delete it, and sometimes we have to attach the new one. So rules and regulations are very important, but we have to get some assistance from international institutions, because sometimes we are away from the outside, so we want to get more knowledge. So that's why the rules and regulations are very important, and we want to get in line with the international best practices, but we need assistance from the international institutions. That's why.
Johan, you don't bid directly for many of these projects. You supply the companies that bid for these projects, right?
We have many different ways in which we supply into infrastructure. I mean, almost every part of economic infrastructure has and our components behind. So when we talk about transmission and distribution, we often supply directly to utilities. When you talk about construction of power plants and so on, we supply to EPC companies who take the overall project, the construction of that, and we supply the core components into that. Same in the renewable space. We have key technology, but not the overall project.
What would be most helpful for companies like yours? What would be most helpful in terms of investing in ASEAN infrastructure or expanding ASEAN infrastructure?
I think one of the things that's key is these compelling visions and plans for a country. Where do you want to go? And then making sure that the infrastructure plans fit in with that vision, and make sure that that is clear and that spans beyond political cycles, which is often very short. I mean, we talk about 30, 40, 50-year investments we're making. Then regulation is very important, that we have regulation that encourages the right capital to flow to the right infrastructure. And subsidies is a major issue. I mean, it's not subsidies per se, but it is to make sure that whatever we do encourages the right behavior and capital to flow to the right places. And I think in the region, in many parts of the region, subsidies are not helping us with that.
And so the frustration for me is the money is there, and you also know the effect, the positive effect, if the money were invested. You were telling me a while ago you had some examples of how electricity changed certain communities.
Yes, I mean, it's often not that visible for us because we don't often deal directly with the public, but yesterday morning we had a session on solar power, and Mr. Jim Ayala was there sharing some of the stories that just from the Philippines, and that touched my heart in a way, because he talked about a school in a certain region, and that school consistently came last right at the bottom every year, and they had no access to electricity. Then with a small solar power plant, they provided electricity, powered up some computers, and within 2 years went to the... And you think of the human capital that is not fully exploited in the region by not providing access to electricity. And a staggering fact to me is in ASEAN, 50% of households still cook with biomass. So enormous numbers. So we have a very large task to make a difference in people's lives. He was talking about mothers giving birth by the light of a mobile phone, and infant mortality rates dramatically improving when electricity is provided. So we can make a great difference.
Again, before you answer that, wait, Stephen, you answer that, and then we'll call on Noel.
Again, I mean, just to second what Johan said, and I think it's really critically important because we all too often, in this region, in the world, we see vested interest masquerading as national interest. And we need to do much better at distinguishing between those two things. And then lastly, just on the point of how we mitigate and how we use these savings, you mentioned our ASEAN Infrastructure Fund, which ADB is supporting with the ASEAN countries, and this is actually at trying to find ways that you can use this savings in the region, these reserves, and have those invested in productive assets. It's very small at the moment. It's sort of experimental, but it's an effort on part of all the ASEAN nations to try to figure out how we can move this forward.
Mr. Razon, both here and abroad, how do you navigate or negotiate with these governments who use vested interests masquerading as national interests?
Well, that happens all over the place. We do business in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and that's part of the landscape, so to speak. And I'd say India, for example, is a very difficult place where you experience a lot of these type of things.
As an investor, are there countries, I'm not going to ask you to name them, are there countries you write off because you figured out it's just too difficult to invest there?
Well, with us, we try to stick it out and be able to operate in any environment. I mean, we stayed in Syria for years, until finally having to pull the plug. But there are a few, actually, that even us avoid.
Noel, please introduce yourself and tell us who you want to ask that question of.
Noel Bonan from KPMG. My question is addressed to Stephen. Stephen, about the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund. Now, clearly, the private sector, when they get into infrastructure projects, have different goals. That you mentioned bankability. In the case of the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund, which is directed to governments, clearly governments have a different mindset when going to infrastructure projects, which is public service. Several questions about the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund. What would be the main criteria for a country to access the infrastructure fund? Number two, what is the acceptance level among governments of the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund? And number three, what would be the ideal or optimum mix between a country's own, out-of-pocket funding, tapping into the fund on, say, specific projects? Would there be an optimum percentage of capital versus loans from the fund?
Thank you. It's a great question, and to the last part about optimal mix, I think go back to Ricky's point that walang kambal. There are no twins here as far as these individual investments are concerned. So it really depends on the individual project. It depends on the circumstances around which that investment is being made. The acceptance of the fund itself is very high. The governments are quite keen and very, very supportive of this initiative. But again, it's very small. It's about $485 million at the moment. All of the member countries have made contributions to the fund. ADB has put $150 million into it, and really we're starting with supporting smaller projects or taking small slices of bigger projects in order to test this idea and get a track record in which we could use then to go to the capital directly and raise bonds and get more funding.
That is the big criteria of because obviously all these projects will be backed.
Well, it's of course there's due diligence that goes into it as it would go into any project that we do. So it's infrastructure. It has to have some kind of connectivity element to it, and lastly, it's got to be bankable. It has to have a financial and economic return.
Did anyone want to add to that from the panel? Okay, I think we have a question over here.
Astrid Taminas from Microsoft. I'd like to address a question really to anyone who'd like to answer this. So when I think about accelerating ASEAN infrastructure, I think about Singapore, whose infrastructure can compete with the best out there, whether it's the airport or an integrated petrochemical industry, water, etc. So if there are any lessons to be drawn from that, and understand there are differences among countries, but if you think about a case study, we do have a pretty clear-cut case study. So what would you say if there's one thing maybe that really is salient from that story of one city-state that did the infrastructure thing correctly, what would you say? Thank you.
Whom were you asking that of?
Maybe Stephen could begin.
Stephen again. The next question cannot go to Stephen.
Yeah, I won't say any more. But I think, again, it goes back to the list that I put out earlier. It goes back to, good project structuring, good governance and understanding and communication between the public and the private sectors. It goes to municipal finance. It goes to deeper capital markets, and it goes to just general, dependency. I mean, Singapore is dependent on the region. It exists as a small city-state within a bigger region, and so they, of any ASEAN country, understand that the incredible necessity of interconnectivity. Governance. It comes down to governance.
Leadership.
LKY. Lee Kuan Yew. That's
leadership.
all. Light is in my eyes. Is this Amina? Yes. Question over here.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Mr.
Could you introduce yourself to the audience?
I'm Amina Rasul from the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy, and I come from an island province of Sulu. Most of the people in Sulu have never had electricity. What you said about using the light of the cell phone to when somebody's giving in childbirth, that happens in Sulu.
How did they charge the cell phone?
When they come to the capital towns. In these areas, they pay 20 pesos, that's $50, so that a boatman can bring their cell phone to a town that has electricity to be charged. There are big areas all over East Asia, especially ASEAN, where this reality is the case. But governments don't really invest in infrastructure for power or for water because it's not cost effective. And my question is do companies like ABB look at this mass of people who are disenfranchised to look at the possibility of small, cost effective products and services that could provide them with water and electricity, solar being one among them? But I understand that solar may not be that efficient. So is there anything else that would be possible to provide infrastructure to areas that have never had them?
Well, I mean, that is the mission of our company, and that's what we spend our R&D money on, is to make sure that we make this more efficient, more effective, cheaper, more affordable, and creating more value. I think we need both. We need the traditional large grid developments, high-capacity transmission links, because there is efficiency in that. And at the same time, we've got to be working at getting electricity to rural communities. And in ASEAN, that's a particular challenge because we have so many people living in remote areas. And, I mean, very recently our company made a $1 billion investment acquiring a company with key solar technology that we can combine with our portfolio. And one of the things that would do is it would help us with key technology to support exactly the sort of smaller scale microgrids, electricity provision into remote areas, so that you don't have to wait until the grid reaches there. And eventually you can still integrate that with the grid and get the benefit of efficiency. But again, as I said, we must make sure that it's not that cheap, for other unfriendly technologies to not help us bring electricity, kerosene subsidies and things like that, to make sure that there's a reward for investing in electricity and sustainable power supplies in these communities.
Mr. Razon, correct me if I'm wrong, were you thinking when you asked that question, why hasn't someone created a small enough genset that they don't need to transport? I was
just wondering if they have the cell phone light, how did they charge the cell phone if there was no electricity?
Why no one seen the opportunity to put a cell phone charging station?
Actually, electricity, I think, is on its own will probably develop on its own, solve itself, because companies who are in the power generation and power distribution business do make money. And that, I guess that sector is probably attracting the most investments of all sectors.
Also the most political attention.
Also.
But that's what you were saying, Mr. Villiers, about subsidies and that kind of thing. You would rather they don't exist because it'll find the market, right? The market will find it, rather.
I don't know. That's the answer to everything. And there's regulation needed, because you can imagine that if you start with a few homes connected to a solar power source, and when in a village, that immediately creates demand. And as this scales up, who will then eventually run that infrastructure? And does the regulation allow for an entrepreneur to come and run that infrastructure, which when the maintenance needs, and because there's no fuel that is supplied, you go and install this once, and the maintenance needs is totally different from a normal utility. So are we thinking about regulation that will allow entrepreneurs to start running and collecting fees for infrastructure like this? Because it could really change the livelihoods of people.
Charging cell phones.
We will ask the Philippine government official that, and I'll get back to you on that. There was a question here also in the first row. Could you please introduce yourself and tell us whom you want to ask?
Purab Surem from Mongolia. There are some initiative to create a new bank, ASEAN Infrastructure Bank. There are some nations invited to be the founding members, some not, I think. There's a question on Mr. Grove. Again, is there some coordination to avoid overlap between ADB or some new bank, or it's changing for you?
I said the next question couldn't go to Stephen. Before you answer that, Stephen, could I ask if there's another question, and then we could perhaps ask them together? Yes. Anyone else? Okay, Karen Davila.
But my question's for Mr. Razon, specifically. Are you satisfied with how the government is spending for infrastructure in the Philippines? And why do you think hasn't the President's PPPs taken off as expected?
Well, it's a very slow and tedious process to get such a massive program off the ground. And it's understandable that people are impatient. But the government actually is spending more and more. They could spend more on roads in Metro Manila than they are. I think they should spend more in that type of infrastructure. Of course, the biggest, I'd say the 800-pound gorilla in the room is a new airport. But governments all over the world work this way. It takes a long time to get these programs off the ground. And once momentum starts, then usually they start moving along at a good pace. But to get to that point we have to be very patient. But I believe that they are allocating more and more funding in the budget. The government can certainly afford it now, although sometimes we still have that mentality for the past that we can't afford this type of infrastructure, when in fact we can now. Nowadays, I said it's almost nearly a golden age for financing, especially for governments. And our government in particular is investment grade. Cost of funding is very cheap at the moment, and we can do it. And you just have to be patient. Governments take time.
Okay, so we veer away a bit from the Philippines. Stephen, could you answer that question about the...
Very briefly. The APEC summit last year, President of China Xi Jinping announced their intention to set up an Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And our basic opinion on this is that the demand for infrastructure investment in Asia is huge. It's $8 trillion between now and 2020. So there's plenty of room for other financiers, other investments. And so we'd be happy to work with this institution if and when it is established.
Okay, we're running into the last 5 minutes of the session. If there's any more, okay, there's one question over there. I think is that Ed? Yes. This will be our last question, then we'll just wrap up before we go.
Okay. It's more, I guess, it's a question for the other countries because.
Could you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
I'm Ed Francisco from BDO, a local bank. I guess we're fortunate here to have the liquidity and the funding available from the private sector. So for us, it's really more getting the projects out. And I agree with what Mr. Razon said about, government should just build it and then it can get funded through ODA or from the banks. My question is, how can the other countries learn from this? Because it's more the institutional buildings that's necessary at this point. Funding is plentiful. It's really, what can you do, I guess, the WEF and the rest of the country so that you get the projects out faster? Funding is not the issue. And even a new bank may not meet the necessary because the funding is here. Maybe equity and for hybrid, for mezz, fine. For the senior secured, it's all available. Thank you.
Was that questions directed at someone specifically, Ed?
I guess for the other countries, or so that they how can we help each other? No.
Yeah.
Funding?
Could I ask Mr. Lam?
No, I didn't really hear the question, but in terms of we're talking about how quickly get the funding out and so on and so forth. One of the things that Vietnam do a lot of now is just privatize the infrastructure asset. So that's the quickest way for the government to get the money in and then use that money for infrastructure project.
How many % of those end up in a dispute?
I'm sorry?
How many % of those end up in some kind of dispute?
Dispute?
Yes. Rival bidders disputing each other?
Not many so far.
So you find that the bidding was structured properly?
I believe so. Because we did participate on a number of these. Water treatment plan, power plant, they do privatize. And then, I mean, now we even negotiate with one province where we said, look, you know, what if you privatize that water treatment plant, you're using our money, and then you expand into another project, or let us expand on the existing plan. So that's one way for them to quickly get the money and do some other things.
Okay, so let me, as we wrap up, let me ask each of the panelists for just a 1-minute comment. Let me begin with the minister. Minister, from the discussion today, it seems like the money is there. The problem is the regulations aren't.
Yeah.
How quickly do you think Myanmar can act on those kinds of concerns?
Very good questions, because we have a lesson learned from others is very important for us, because sometimes we have to reluctant to do rapidly, because we would like to see what's the problems or what's the experience for the others. But anyway, now we are trying today. I got so many lessons from all the participants. So our country have to move forward. So we need some persistence to do this, all that. But anyway, we have to do rapidly, or sometimes we have to to take care about that. Sometimes we have to cheat. The quick win is very important. Sometimes we have to cheat to see for the long run. So for this matters, we want to develop our infrastructures. Now we have to do first.
Okay, thank you very much. Could I ask Stephen, how is the ADB helping other countries work on that list that you recited to us earlier?
Well, we do it through a number of different avenues, largely through our lending windows. We have concessional lending, we have market-based lending. We also have significant technical assistance resources that we bring to bear at advising and helping our governments work through some of these challenges. But I think why we're talking about this and why it's important is that, you know, infrastructure and the provision of infrastructure underpins, you know, the ability of the region to address the critical challenge it faces with respect to inclusive growth, with respect to there's a huge number of people that live in this region that are mired in poverty. So we have a moral imperative here, we have a social imperative here, because the longer these people live in these dire circumstances, the more social unrest can occur. And lastly, there's an economic imperative. If we don't address these issues, the kind of growth that we're seeing in this region will not be sustained. And so if we want to see it sustained, if we want to see this region succeed, these kinds of investments are absolutely critical.
So let me ask you, what's the one thing, what's the one or the most important thing that governments have to learn and apply in order to accelerate infrastructure?
Well, to structure projects, whether they're government or private sector or PPP projects, is to structure them properly from the beginning, both the legal basis, the project components, and to beef up the capability and the talent within the government to execute such projects.
Is that the main difficulty, that there's not enough capability, they don't have enough experience yet in crafting these?
I think the government, aside from, because that's part of infrastructure as well, is capability. And government needs to invest in their project capability, whether it's execution, whether it's project review, decision-making on what projects are priority, financing of the projects. I mean, this all involve capabilities and human resources, and which is a key component of infrastructure in the government in itself.
Mr. Lam, what would make it easier for investors such as yourself to invest in infrastructure?
I think the the thing that make it easier is again, the government should look at not giving us 100 projects, but just focus on a few key ones and just make sure it's bankable. It's like you're packaging a product, so that once the product is packaged nicely, all wrapped up, then you can bring the investor in. It's more bankable.
Mr. De Villiers, as a supplier, what would make the ASEAN infrastructure expansion more profitable and more efficient for you?
I'm not sure it's a question of what we take from it. I mean, we want to create value in this, and I think I'm impressed with. I mean, there's an enormous opportunity to make a difference in this region, and we want to do that. And I think there's a sense of urgency that is clear. We need to do this quickly. So we know what to do. Technology is available. We heard that finance is available. So I mean, we have to act with courage and with conviction, and so balance the amount of time spent discussing and talking and taking action, the specific action. And maybe one last point is that we need to do this sustainably, because we are leaving a legacy for the future generations. And the way in which we invest in the infrastructure projects we choose today is either going to hold our future generations back, or it's going to accelerate them in their growth path.
Could you give us an illustration of how much you spend or what you do in terms of R&D in order to develop new technologies or more affordable technologies?
Well, we have a global program of R&D, spending literally billions of dollars in R&D, collaborating with universities right around the world in every aspect of infrastructure investment. And that's our commitment to continue to do that. That is the DNA of our company.
And finally, Mr. Whalen, for agencies such as yourself, what would make it easier for you to be able to help places like ASEAN develop their infrastructure?
Well, nobody makes it easy for us. That's not our mission. But I think what we're hearing in the audience and on the panel is the tension that exists. Getting it done fast and getting it done right. And getting it done right takes a lot of effort to be able to do it in a fashion which is repeatable and sustainable. But certainly for OPIC and for any other official agency, be it ADB or be it the potential of the Asian Infrastructure Bank, it's very important when we're thinking about this to make sure we're doing it in a fashion which have safeguards in place for local communities, for the environment, and for workers who work on these projects. And also to make sure that they're reaching out. Singapore is a fantastic model, but the problems of Singapore as a relatively compact island are different than the problems of an archipelago such as the Philippines or Indonesia. So we exist at a golden age of financing. We existed in a golden age of innovation in terms of where we do have technologies that can create the networks that can go out to these communities. And that's another thing that we have to keep in mind as well.
Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, please help me in thanking our wonderful and thank you for joining us, and thank you to our audience for joining us. My name is Coco Alquas from ABS-CBN Corporation here at the World Economic Forum in East Asia. Thanks for watching.
Ating pong napanood ang session on accelerating ASEAN strategic infrastructure. They talked about public-private partnership programs, and we both know that the Philippine government is encouraging the private sector to engage in the PPP.
I think it was an important point in the discussion wherein they were talking particularly whether or not investments can be done by the private sector alone. And it was very clear that there are some investments that have to be undertaken by the government alone, in fact, and the private sector cannot be expected to invest, particularly because there are certain investments that are not financeable or bankable, as they would say.
Profitable for the private. According to Mr. Enrique Razon of the MICP, he says that PPP are ideal for high-density areas, and private companies are keen on investing on the power sector or on power-generating projects, as well as the ports, the seaports.
I think this is an interesting point, particularly because if you would go to this forum and not expect anything, you would actually assume that everyone would be for private investments. But it was a very important highlight of that discussion that the public funds must also pour in, particularly because we cannot ensure that that private corporations will be interested in all the investments needed.
The speakers in the session also identified the needs of the ASEAN region so that the private sector will be encouraged to invest in the region. Specifically, there are legal impediments to owning businesses in certain member countries in the ASEAN. For example, in Myanmar, foreigners are not allowed to own land, but it is the same here in our country. So I was wondering what made Myanmar different from the Philippines when, in fact, these laws that the speaker was saying is an impediment for the private sector to invest on Myanmar does not hamper the private sector to invest here in our country.
And we were talking about this a while ago, Kathy, and I was thinking that it may be possible that it's probably because of the military junta that has been going on in Myanmar for a very long time, and it was only recently that they actually democratized as a political system.
One of the speakers also said that there is a need for an ASEAN code for bidding an infrastructure project, although JC, each country is different. These, if there is a code, a bidding code for foreigners, then it would facilitate investment in the region. We will be back with our special coverage of the 23rd World Economic Forum on East Asia right after this break.